light of at least one of them, the word single-handed, I'd like to dedicate this paper, as I'm very actually appreciative of being invited to speak to you, dedicate this paper to all of those people, academics and other people in the professional domains of the cultural sector, who contributed an enormous amount to the attempt to establish an independent national humanities organisation in New Zealand. Now, in the context of the conference, you might still say, why look at the question of the creative university from the perspective of the humanities? It seems rather counterintuitive, I'd have to say, especially given the picture of the global university system provided by the data sources discussed by Simon at the opening of the conference. Impossible to make anything commensurate between that account and the sense I have of where the humanities sit in the current arrangements. I'll set out my destination for the paper at the beginning with two quotations. I think I'll say at this point that my plan is to refer selectively to about 5 or 6 particular topic sources which are attached to individual names and publications. I'm going to do it that way as a way of also, I think, acknowledging something to do with that's intrinsic to the humanities. The first quotation comes from Stanley Robinson's novel 2312. It could also be an epigraph for my talk, I think. To form a sentence is to collapse many superposed wave functions to a single thought universe. Multiplying the lost universes word by word, we can say that each sentence extinguishes 10 to the n universes, where n is the number of words in the sentence. Each thought condenses trillions of potential thoughts. Thus we get verbal overshadowing where the language we use structures the reality we inhabit. Maybe this is a blessing. Maybe this is why we need to keep making sentences. So, first of all, an emphasis upon both the enormous productivity and resource that language represents, and also the implications of actually using language to form a sentence out of the many that could be formed, but that further point, always new sentences are there to be formed, need to be formed, and that's a crucial question that I want to keep in the foreground. The other point, the other quotation, comes from a powerful critique of the university from the perspective of Indigenous knowledge. And I should say, I think, Simon, you used the word Indigenous to mean national. Obviously here I mean First Nation or some equivalent phrase like that. Rauna Kukanen has written from her perspective as a Sami. The Diatnu, regarded as one of the best salmon rivers in Europe, is considered the border between Norway and Finland. For many of us along the river, the Diatnu is not a border, but rather a bond that connects the families who live on its banks. I want to start by situating myself, this is in respect of her study and the book as a whole, with the Diatnu, a river that runs through my home in Sami land. The Diatnu's fluid, shifting nature defies clear fixed boundaries. This ambiguity is the river's strength, which cannot be reduced to binary oppositions. Literally, the river, both as a physical entity and as a concept metaphor, demands that we look beneath the surface. Cultural and linguistic mingling has a long history along the Diatnu and is still taken for granted by many local people. Communication along the river takes place in various languages, and there are always people who do not understand all of the languages spoken. This is entirely normal. I'd like to suggest, in amplifying that first quotation, that this particular statement could be taken as a concept metaphor, not just for language, but clearly also for the university in its modality as an institution through time, focusing knowledge but bringing and mingling many different languages, as the point says, not all of which any member of that university understands. So what I want to sketch here about the conditions required for the existence of Creative University is embedded in these statements and is readily highlighted if the Diatnu is taken as a concept metaphor for language in the university. The interactivity between universes of thought in formation, formal knowledge, cultural identity, which are effected and sustained by languages in their localities and across times and spaces, are both the substance of the humanities and the vital source of creativity. In other words, the case I want to make is that the humanities can if properly recognised as making present in the university the plenitude of language and languages, and enabled to perform this function, which of course the field is increasingly being prevented from doing, provide a route towards grasping what systemically makes it possible to locate creativity at the core of the university. So the steps I plan to take are these ones, and my thought is that each of these points here represents elements in what we could describe as a heuristic, a way of checking against an institutional or cultural state of affairs for what factors are most relevant and significant in it. Of course, I've chosen these as an account of a certain version of the humanities. My view about the humanities, as they are now and as they have developed from the Reformation, is that they are an array of knowledges, textually and disciplinarily constituted, the common work of which is the interpretation of the textual production of a culture or cultures, with the aim of assisting that culture's more complete understanding. But I'd like to sort of just repeat that. A particular collection of knowledges that are textually constructed, first of all, that's their primary materials, and of course disciplinarily constructed as well, the purpose of which is to interpret the textual production of a culture with the aim of more complete self-understanding. To achieve the highest level of abstraction and codification appropriate to academic knowledge work, the academic humanities employ a range of investigative and interpretative techniques and theories appropriate to the objects, providing the material equivalent of nature or the given world for the scientist. And once again, I want to stress that the textual objects studied, are just as much a part of the material world as anything else anyone might study. Put more summarily, the humanities came into existence when writing was invented and exist in an interdependent relationship with writing technologies of all kinds. Now, it's obvious, I believe what I'm going to say now, the humanities are granted no value in the present era of neoliberal and technocratic valuations of knowledge, because both the method and object of research, textual interpretation, and the universe of knowledge created by humanity over the period of human history, both of those are regarded as not productive of certain knowledge or knowledge of significant economic value. Whatever the claim one might want to make about the postmodern affirmation of uncertainty and indeterminacy as a constitutive factor in knowledge creation, transmission and reception, it remains the case that this attempt to bring the academic humanities into a closer association with their proper materials and methods has not significantly affected, except perhaps negatively, their position in the Western University of the Humanities, the position of the humanities in the Western University as knowledge creators. In the present, the humanities disciplines which are regarded as of most value are those which can be positioned most closely to the sciences, history and philosophy in particular, and those aspects of other humanities disciplines which employ empirical methods and digital technologies. Happily, or interestingly, whatever way you look at it, the first text of literary theory in English, Sir Philip Sidney's Defence of Poetry, anticipated this situation and is opposing poetry to history and philosophy as modes of formulating knowledge and conducting inquiry. In the same way, I'm disposed to privilege my own field, the least disciplined of humanities fields, English literature. But meaning by English literature at this point to embrace the study of aesthetic texts in all media, including performance, print, still and moving images, music, mass media and digital media, that field which of course is represented by the school that I recently belonged to. The point of emphasising that collection and the lack of discipline in the humanities field and its marginality is emphasised that the core characteristic of all those texts that I've listed, those kinds of texts, is that they are fictions. Most of them are fictions. The sceptical humanist tradition articulated through the textual and linguistic work of scholars in the early Reformation has reasserted itself in the late 20th century by new generations of textual and cultural theorists. The importance of this link cannot be underestimated, since the parallels between the Reformation and the postmodern, most notably in the introduction of a new knowledge system, science, and a new method for producing knowledge of nature, sorry, that's science, and the introduction of a new information and communication technology, print then and digital media now, that comparison is very close and of very considerable importance. So why are the humanities now not recognised or creating that recognition themselves as the means by which an epistemic break is created between the dominant modern system of knowledge creation and authorisation and what is coming into existence under the apparently now passé term, the postmodern? The New Zealand government, among other Western democracies, may be unique in the completeness of its erasure of the humanities from its conception of knowledge work and what constitutes knowledge of value. Traditional conceptions are endorsed through awards to authors of fiction and non-fiction and the funding of creative research through Creative New Zealand. But the cultural sector is not integrated into government policy or funding for knowledge creation. The use of terms like creative industries and cultural industries obscures the fundamental question of the nature of knowledge work, which is characteristic of the cultural sector, and especially of the academic humanities, which is or ought to be its most abstract and theoretical dimension. It also obscures the profound dependency of the humanities on public conservation of society's texts in archives, museums, libraries, and their digital extensions. And I'd refer to the paper we heard, at least I heard amongst some of you, about the digital library in Taiwan as a very good example in this conference of the crucial questions that arise from the heterogeneity of objects protected and preserved in these cultural repositories and why they are of such fundamental importance, even if, once again, there is not a good account of them in the context of a knowledge system and its purposes. We need a more capacious model of the humanities as a body of culturally fundamental knowledge at work in society than that which is provided by the typical representation of it in the distribution of modern academic disciplines. That distribution respects more the needs and purposes of the institution of the modern university than it does the distinctive historical and future purposes of the humanities as a mode of knowing. What I want to do is to sketch the parameters of a discussion which I believe is urgently needed, both in the humanities and by government, insofar as government now determines much of what universities do. It's urgently needed in government because current official thinking is destroying the foundations of the kinds of knowledge work postmodern societies need for their very survival. It's urgently needed in the humanities so that they may recover and reassert their fundamental role in knowledge creation. For this reason, I'm concerned with that aspect of, or potential of the humanities, which will be very familiar to you, Derrida has called the new or transformed humanities, the humanities to come, and his view that the space of the new humanities will not let itself be contained within the traditional limits of the departments that today belong by their very status to the humanities. So I'm not aiming to talk about, to create a justification for the present body of knowledge represented by traditional academic disciplines in the humanities. Derrida's call for a new or transformed humanities is part of what we have to attend to in the conversation like this. The humanities to which he refers is one capable of taking on the tasks of deconstruction, beginning with the deconstruction of their own history and their own axioms, but extending to embrace everything that concerns the question and the history of truth in its relation to the question of man, of what is proper to man, without condition and without presupposition. He also links this inquiry to the question of literatures, to a certain democratic institution that is called literature or literary fiction. This new humanities is for Derrida an exemplary manifestation, the exemplary manifestation, I should say, of the university without condition. The principal right to say everything, whether it be under the heading of fiction and the experimentation of knowledge, and the right to say it publicly and to publish it. In their reference to publishing, Derrida recognises both the issue of the marketplace in publishing and the role it plays in archivisation, evaluation, and the legitimation of academic research. He also recognises the importance of making work public by finding the best access to a new public space transformed by new techniques of communication, information, archivisation, and knowledge production. So, critical to what I'm saying about the humanities, of course, is a change, fundamental change, in the society's communication media. That transforms the humanities conceivably more than it transforms any other body of knowledge because of the intrinsic connection between humanity's objects and media of communication. The university without condition is a unique institutional space within society in which nothing is beyond question. Its research work open and public, a human invention generating new knowledge about humanity. The challenges for the humanities and the university which Derrida advances here are complex and urgent, and they apply with equal force to a possible form of the university to come, which is the subject of this conference, the creative university. To advance the implications of this concept of the new humanities and their distinctive claim to knowledge work, I'll introduce two conceptualisations which bear upon Derrida's phrase, the space of the new humanities, and then consider their implications for thinking about creativity and innovation. These two references are to concepts and a concept map which come from quite different domains, but which I think bear closely upon a great deal of what this conference has been about. I'd like to think, in fact, that the conference itself and each paper that we've heard here is itself an instance of what I'm now going on to talk about, called the semiosphere, and also what otherwise I'll come to, called the information space. So first of all, the semiosphere. A strand in my representation of the humanities is that the objects which constitute its field of inquiry and the knowledge outcomes of that inquiry are in reality and participate in the ongoing formation of reality. Hence, like physical objects in space and time of the given world, semiotic objects also occupy space and time, but in a distinctive manner. They combine in themselves the virtual and the actual. One helpful term for that dimension of space, which also immediately applies to the space occupied by the university, is Lotman's term semiosphere, which is defined as the intellectual world in which humanity and society are unfolded and which is in constant interaction with the individual intellectual world of human beings. The semiosphere is that synchronic semiotic space which fills the borders of culture. Semiotic because every single component of it is in principle simultaneously always present. It is always already there as the filling the space of culture. Later on in the book, he writes that the semiosphere, the space of culture, is not something that acts according to mapped out and pre-calculated plans. It seethes like the sun. Centres of activity boil up in different places in the depths and on the surface, irradiating relatively peaceful areas with its immense energy. But unlike that of the sun, the energy of the semiosphere is the energy of information, the energy of thought. So once again, a concept metaphor which helps advance the notion of the way in which this work, this knowledge created by human effort, participates in what we understand reality to be. Among the many important implications of this view and this concept of the semiosphere is that it locates the order of information in culture rather than in the more restricted domain of research and the economy, with the consequence that the latter can be understood as a special case within a specific cultural formation. Lotman doesn't need the terms creativity or innovation to identify a specific but not necessarily constant feature of the space of culture, the formation of the new in whatever form, because he attributes an inherently dynamic character to the engagement of minds with information. The latter enfolding, but not the possession of any individual or group or institution. The semiosphere as a concept accounts for how attempts to discipline information and knowledge must always fail, however powerful they may be for periods of time, as cultural agents explore the potentials of accumulated human knowledge, in Derrida's phrase, without condition. Another important implication is that the contents of the semiosphere are in principle totally inclusive. Nothing once thought may be finally lost. Everything that has been thought and recorded, of course, everything that's been thought and recorded may be thought again in a new context of another human mind active in a specific time and place. Crucially, of course, if societies do not conserve the knowledge they create and make it publicly accessible, it is lost to the collective memory. In short form, the semiosphere is a name for the real world of materials and knowledge work of the humanities. It also identifies, in the attribution of energy to information, how differently the work of the university can be understood if it derives from the qualities of the semiosphere but carries out a special function within the general human activity of thought. Thinking doesn't only occur in the university, but special characteristics of that process do definitely occur in the university. The other term I wish to insert into the discussion, as I suggested, is this term I-space, a conceptualisation of information developed from the analysis of business organisations. Max Boissaud's knowledge assets provides a model of what he terms the information space, which, while applied to understanding the evolution of the business firm, extends it to its most general form as a conceptualisation of the space of cultural knowledge and cultural production and reproduction. As Boissaud describes it, the I-space is a conceptual framework within which the behaviour of information flows can be explored, and through these, the creation and diffusion of knowledge within selected populations can be understood. It's a dynamic space constituted by three dimensions: concrete, abstract, undiffused, diffused, uncodified, codified. Now this is a representation of the I-space in that form with the three axes and the conceptual polarizations of those axes. Just to briefly give a bit of content for those of you who aren't familiar with this to his key terms, the codified, uncodified pole has to do with whether phenomena can or cannot be meaningfully categorised. The abstract concrete axis has to do with phenomena that are characterised by numerous categories, and on the concrete end that are resisting abstraction, to the other end categories that are fully abstracted. The diffused, undiffused pole has to do with whether or not the kind of phenomena a population has access to are too large to be comprehended in any agreed categorising way by that population. So undiffused, impossible, effectively impossible to categorise. The curved line that runs through the diagram is an expression of the proposition or the postulate that the more codified and abstract an item of information, the more extensively it will diffuse within a target population in a given time. So codification and abstraction are critical to diffusion of information. And you can see once again where the university starts fitting into these processes seen this way. So that's the kind of basic plot, and there's just two other versions of this I want to put in front of you because I think they help indicate how this can be used, but also indicate ways in which it might be applied to the conference in our circumstances. I've jumped the order that he had in his book because I wanted to pick up this second one next. He sees coming out of the dynamic circulation of information in the I-space three particular modes of structure of relationships in that space, which he calls ordered, complex and chaotic. And it's quite, you might say, ordered means closed in effect. Chaotic means beyond management or serious intellectual control. And what obviously I want to suggest or raise by introducing this set of possibilities is a question in respect of, first of all, our own research, because each of us is obviously working on a subset of the semiosphere in our work. Where in this particular structure would you locate your work? Because going through this kind of analysis is a way of recognising just how complex the kind of thing we're talking about as the university, or particularly the creative university as a version of the university to come, actually is. Because we have to actually figure out how our own subset of everything going on in that space contributes to something called the institution of the university and to certain sorts and kinds of outcomes from that work. Where would you place creativity and innovation as a mode of relation to information in this kind of structure? Where would you place not just your own research, but your discipline in that structure in relation to the range of options from ordered through complex to chaotic? I rather suspect that if we're following through many of the implications of the term creative that we've been considering, we would have to locate the term creative somewhere towards the chaotic dimension of this space. What happens to discipline structures in that context? What happens to order especially? What happens when we start going beyond what might be manageable complexity? Is that where the creative university is to be located in the information space? Well, Bossart offers an account of this also, applying it to institutions. And we'd probably agree that the university typically fits somewhere up there in that area marked out by bureaucracies. He defines bureaucracies as organisations engaged in the controlled diffusion of well-codified narrative and abstract symbolic information to selected members of a given population, which may quite well describe in abstract form the university as we know it. He obviously distinguishes that quite sharply, though, from the kind of organisation that is engaged in a movement of knowledge and information both out of the space of the undiffused, space of the diffused, out of that space, through processes of codification and back into that dimension of the space again. Now, Boissart's analysis, how am I doing for time? I lost track to start with. Okay, right, okay. I'll try not to. Boissart's analysis is quite directly and explicitly about the business firm as an informational construct, a particular mode of operating within the information space, and that's what he focuses his attention on. But he does, though, he's very clearly recognising the fact that this model, he doesn't apply it to the university as another kind of institution, but this model is capable of that kind of analysis because it's a heuristic. It provides a means of plotting relationships in an abstract space. He also, though, has a chapter in the first book called Culture as a Knowledge Asset, and I want to say a little bit about that. His purpose in this chapter is to demonstrate that it does not make much sense to talk of knowledge assets independently of the cultures in which they are embedded. He observes that it's only a small part of what we call cultural knowledge that gets itself embedded in technologies and artefacts. The large parts embodied in social processes, institutional practices and traditions, many of which are carried around in people's heads, but of course also many of which exist as texts as well. For this reason, cultural knowledge has been taken for granted. At best, it's perceived to be behaviourally useful knowledge. What I want to claim, of course, is that cultural knowledge is the stuff of the work of the humanities altogether, and that, broadly speaking, that's what is produced in and contained, conserved and recycled through the semiosphere. He defines culture, he says culture operates at many levels of aggregation, which of course we know very well from our own operation in university and outside it. We can talk of the culture of the group, the firm, the industry, the profession, the region, the country, even a group of countries. Yet at whatever level we choose to define it, national, regional, industrial or corporate, culture remains the means by which non-genetic information is transmitted either within a given generation or from one generation to the next. And I want to claim that statement right back for the humanities. Non-genetic information. I say that is what the semiosphere contains, what it conserves, and what particularly in their work of analysing, critiquing texts the humanities are most profoundly engaged with. That is, every piece of information that human beings have created, in effect, and that includes science. Although cultural knowledge is typically associated with the local, the particularistic, and the contextual, in Boisset's account, it can manifest any of the dimensions which constitute the I space. He notes that an item of knowledge has to be internalised by contemporaries as well as by descendants before it can be properly considered cultural. Knowledge which counts as cultural has an inheritance dimension integral to it. Culture can be thought of as a kind of collective memory whose spatio-temporal reach is determined by that of its biological and physical substrates. Furthermore, he says, individual agents typically have multiple affiliations and are therefore subject to multiple cultural influences that interact and overlay each other. Thus, the cultural influences that bear down on a given data processing agent, whether the agent be an individual human being, a small group, or firm, are often superimposed on each other by overlapping layers. In his account, language is one of the number of discontinuities, like laws and traditions, which nation-states can use to foster a sense of cultural identity among their citizens. Now, that notion of languages as a discontinuity picks up those opening comments about languages as fundamental sources and means to knowledge, but where they're not commensurate. There is no way of simply making one language commensurate with another. Now, I've said that Boisset doesn't apply this analysis to the university as, for example, a bureaucratic organisation, but you can easily see how we can plot various positions for various kinds of university or various forms of it that we know, or various aspects, parts of it that we occupy, can be plotted in that space. And I think it is helpful to try and do that. In particular, different modes of the humanities can be located at different points in that I space, including, going back to this one, at the most ordered end of the spectrum. There is no body of disciplined knowledge which cannot be closed at the point where it reaches high levels of codification, abstraction, and disciplinary control. The humanities are no different from any other body of knowledge in that respect. But I suppose, broadly speaking, the difference, which must apply in any discipline in the end, comes down to whether in that discipline, people in the community working in it, the culture of it, emphasise order and continuity in knowledge and practice, or disruption and discontinuity. Furthermore, the materials of the humanities can find locations in the space, the I space, depending on whether they're narratively or analytically structured. Once again, this conception doesn't invoke creativity as a necessary explanatory term for discovery and innovation in knowledge work, partly because it assumes the dynamic, informational, institutional, and cultural environment within which individual agents produce and circulate knowledge, rather than locating that dynamic only or primarily in the individual. Because of the conception of the I space as a dynamic environment of agents and institutions engaged in complex cycles of knowledge, work, and engagement, the term creative or the term innovative doesn't really play an immediate part in Boisset's account. Nevertheless, to locate the creative university in relation to the I space, we need to bring together these figures that we've been looking at with Derrida's conception of the university without condition. And going back to this one again, is the university without condition to be located at down towards the domain defined as chaotic, without supposition, without presupposition, a place operating outside, in one respect, a domain ordered at least by discipline structures and theories. Now, oops, doing that. The question of creativity and innovation, and it applies to this, since the term, I say, hasn't been a factor in either of these two models, semiosphere and I space, because of the dynamic terms that those two writers are using when they think about information. Energy and flow are key terms that they employ. But these, of course, are also conventional attributes of creativity, energy and flow. And I think Derrida's term without condition is also a term that we would tend to apply to the state of creativity. The association between creativity as a name for a human capability and the business of bringing the new into existence is very strong. But the term's relation to the work of the modern university is ambiguous, especially when it can be focused on kinds of object and modes of work which are informational and aesthetic in origin, and for which Derrida's term fiction can serve to mark a decisive attribute. Just as the university is the proper site of the most rigorous and systematic and methodological application of intellect to the understanding of the given world, so it is also the proper site of the most rigorous and systematic methodological application of intellect to the understanding of the cultural worlds invented by humanity. Granted this fundamental division in the object of inquiry, it's not possible to simply allocate the first, analysis of the given world, to the sciences, and the second to the humanities. But by granting equality to both modes of inquiry and knowledge creation, the whole of reality enters the mind of the university as it is constituted outside the university by the interaction of culture with the given world through the medium of language, but also, of course, through other media and through human action. Derrida makes this point in a way which opens up onto a critical factor in the conception of creativity and knowledge work in the humanities when he writes that the limit of the impossible, the perhaps and the if, this is the place where the university is exposed to reality, to the forces from without, be they cultural, ideological, political, economic or other. It is there that the university is in the world that it is attempting to think. That is, in the perhaps and the if, he says, is where the university enters the world it's attempting to think. In order for science to exist, the rigorous suppression of all but the denotative capabilities of language has been undertaken. That's been the business of the formation of scientific discourse over the last 300 to 400 years. That is not a problem, that process of focusing a knowledge work on a very particular aspect of language's capabilities. The problem is the hegemonic claim based on that suppression that scientific method only is capable of generating true knowledge, thus denying any comparable claim by the humanities, which constitutes the problem facing a university which would seek to advance creativity as its defining feature. Because implicit in the term creativity, there are Derrida's phrase without condition, the term fiction, and the concepts of humanity and of democracy. It's only when all that science must exclude in human knowledge formation in order to be itself, it's only when all that, I guess the sentence is wrong. It's only when all that science must exclude in human knowledge formation in order to be itself is brought back into the discussion that a fuller conception of creativity and innovation can be recovered and the conception of the creative university can be articulated. I say recovered because we're in a period in which the science, technology, business nexus has brought about a drastically narrowed use of these terms. As Foucault, for example, has shown with considerable force and clarity, knowledge creation is a textual and an institutional practice, and dominant institutions and discourses substantially determine what kinds of knowledge are valued in particular societies at particular times. To read, therefore, a study of innovation conducted through the discipline of psychology and anthropology in the 1950s is to find oneself in a differently organised frame of inquiry, in which neither government nor the corporation is of particular significance. In his study, Innovation, the Basis of Cultural Change, 1953, H.G. Barnett is interested in a general theory of innovation, and he grounds it in a set of concepts of particular relevance to my interests here. His initial point is twofold. As the title of the book makes clear, it's cultural change, which Barnett takes to be the proper or full context for understanding innovation. In this context, he says, everyone is an innovator, whether popular definitions allow him that recognition or not. From a university or governmental perspective, adopting such a basis for trying to establish policy or direct academic development could seem hopelessly inclusive and incapable of providing the categories needed for defining strategies and priorities. Everyone is an innovator sounds like a chaotic conception, put that way. However, locating this discussion in a proposition that in effect claims that the ability to innovate is human, not specific to a domain of knowledge or a kind of institution, Bartlett ensures that a concept of the creative university must be grounded in a democratic conception of creativity and innovation, if we are prepared to follow that line of thought. Barnett defines an innovation as, quote, any thought, behaviour or thing that is new because it's qualitatively different from existing forms. Innovation is therefore a comprehensive term covering all kinds of mental constructs, whether they can be given sensible representation or not. He notes that because man-made objects have an extra mental existence, it's deceptively easy to formulate a theory of innovation which will purport to describe their conception. It's much easier to explain them as things than as ideas. This special case in his general theory is in effect the exemplary case on which much current innovation strategy is built. By contrast, he affirms that every innovation is a combination of ideas. The only bonds between its parts in a cultural setting are mental connections. Furthermore, the size and complexity of the cultural inventory that's available to an innovator establishes limits within which he must function. A sizable inventory allows for more combinations and limits and permits more differences of approach and problem solution than does a small one. Facility and extent of communication influences the communication of ideas. The domain of innovation is thus the domain identified by Lotman's semiosphere and Boissot's eye space, as indicated by his focus on mental constructs, the cultural setting and the cultural inventory, and the intersections between this collective inheritance and the mental work of individuals. A helpful extension of this orientation is provided by an essay on a performance of Othello, which is concerned with the ability of a theatrical event to reframe human experience for its audience and so release the new in the experience of the audience. Hastrup introduces another key term. Into the consideration of creativity when she argues that, quote, creative agency, in my view, is the capacity to bring the as yet unknown to effect by way of imaginative power, and through offering access to the potentiality of the moment. Imagination is critical because understanding is an event. We intimate unprecedented incidents or other worlds by means of imaginative projections from previous experience. The logic of imaginative creativity is not distinct from the logic of reasoning. They're aspects of the same capacity for intimation, which is part of our being cultural. Hastrup's argument is based on a distinction between discovery and invention, in which discovery is the outcome of a prior conceptualization, whereas invention produces the ontologically new. Creativity is, as a mode of invention, not only to discover or innovate, it's to reach a new potentiality by finding the ontologically new. In Barnett's and Hastrup's accounts, creativity and innovation refer to a mode of mental work which produces something others will perceive as new. That the outcome could be a commercial product is only a special instance of a general process, not the goal. The context of valuation is cultural, not economic, and no particular kind of knowledge is privileged as the source of the new. It is, however, worth being reminded at this point of a position on innovation put forward in the 1970s by William Kingston. In his study, Innovation, the Creative Impulse in Human Progress, Industry, Art and Science, he writes that innovation is simply one way in which human creative energy is expressed. But it has been characteristic of recent stages in the culture of the West that this particular type of energy has tended to run into technological and technical innovation rather than to survival or liturgy or art or literature. That phrase has tended to run is perhaps a little soft when we consider what's been driving everything in that direction. But anyway, he marks the social evolution another way, acknowledged here by Boissot's analysis, by my including this analysis of the firm in this paper, by proposing that it's now necessary to add business culture to the other two cultures of art and science discussed by C.P. Snow if we want any kind of decent account of what is going on in information spaces in our society and culture. Business culture has to be taken into account, and his book is a very good entry into that discussion, I think. Not that it's undiscussed, but it's a particularly good one. I want just to make two other comments about the question of language and the question of fiction. The Tower of Babel, which was one of the images coming from, I think I was right to say, was in the group of images used in relation to the digital collections from Taiwan. Tower of Babel, a perfect instance of chaos in the domain of knowledge. The official interpretation of Tower of Babel is that it was the destruction of the tower was a punishment for human overreaching, and the way that human overreaching, based on intellect, was devised was to remove a single language and to replace it with mutually incomprehensible languages. God reasserting control over human aspiration. So a move from ordered to chaotic, a move from a single language to multiple languages. Now, a different approach to this whole question of multiple languages was given in a UNESCO report, but once again, those of you in the domain of linguistic diversity policy discussions will be very familiar with this point. If you take seriously the intimate relationship between languages, their cultural environments and contexts, and notice the way in which language tends always to split into dialects, not to move into higher uniformities, but to fragment and break. We have a conception of language as ceaselessly evolving, adapting a means of immediately adapting, responding, and relating to immediate and specific environments. In this context, no language can be affirmed to be inherently superior to any other. Each performs its role in the specific cultural, economic, ecological, and political context. Each describes in a particular way a different environment. This conception points in completely the opposite direction to the desire for a unitary and universal language, which that old account of the Tower of Babel manifested. And also, of course, in that desire insofar as it passes through that restrictive conception of science, where ultimately there should be just one unique language to formulate all the knowledge that is true. It's worth pointing, though, to another source on this discussion about the Tower of Babel. If you've read Neil Stephenson's novel Snow Crash, you will know that there is an extended inquiry carried on in that novel about the meaning of the Tower of Babel. And it's resolved in that novel by affirming the fortunate fall, if you like, the importance of the fracturing of language into languages, on the grounds, in the case of the novel, that the multiplicity of languages prevents anyone, and notably the novel a media corporation, from achieving total control over human communication and information. So what I'm emphasising then in this context of the humanities and the creative university is the critical importance of the plurality of languages, natural and artificial, not any attempt to bring them into uniformity. The creative university has to exist within as full a recognition of the plurality as it possibly can. The other point that I want to make, I'm going to stop quickly, is to do with fiction, because fiction is the scandal that faces the humanities in the university, or any media studies, but the humanities insofar as they're based on texts which are generated within a framework of generating imaginative fictions. Fiction is a scandal because, of course, historically we know that fiction cannot possibly tell the truth. It's a misrepresentation of the world. It's corrupted by the imagination of the artist and so on and so forth. Anciently, fiction was associated with lying, not with telling the truth. And that problem sits there still, because it would be very difficult for anybody to claim now, producing an interpretation of a novel or a poem or a play, even a science fiction like Neil Stephenson's, which offers to be a foresight scenario about the future. Interpreting such a text, to claim that that interpretation offers knowledge that is true, in the current climate, is very hard to sustain. I want just to point to one other story that I'm sure you're familiar with, Borges' story about the discovery of the evidence of a planet called Tlon. Discovered because the 11th volume of the dictionary, the Encyclopedia of Tlon, was discovered in a library somewhere. The problem that is discussed here is what happens when you discover a text that refers to a world that apparently doesn't exist, that apparently isn't part of our knowledge system, isn't real. In this context, this unreal world is fully constructed, but the story indicates just how many different kinds of mind, of knowledge, of writing are required to construct a whole world. But it's affected, and then an object from that world is discovered in the world of the writer, the compass. Such was the first intrusion of this fantastic world into the world of reality. Now, I'm bringing fiction in here because I want to connect it to an aphorism that you'll all be familiar with, Baudrillard's one about the map preceding the territory, which is also premised on a story of Borges. The question I want to ask is, how much of the knowledge that we now create in universities, in our most advanced knowledge-forming institutions, how much of that knowledge is describing the real, how much of it is creating reality? And I'd suggest that increasingly, more and more and more, the knowledge we create creates reality. It doesn't just describe it. And that's, of course, in crucial ways, what has always been the task of fiction. To create alternative realities, which then may come into existence through human application and effort, imagining, action, and so on. So I'd like to suggest that an intimate correlation is developing in our knowledge systems and our universities between what anciently we called fiction and regarded as off to one side, and the fundamental work of the university across all its disciplines. And it's somewhere in there that creativity can be thought to come from. The semiosphere is limited only to the extent that human knowledge is conserved and remains accessible. But for the university to locate itself fully in the semiotic space of culture, it must widen its scope and restrain the social forces internal and external to it, which will seek to control and delimit its engagements in and beyond the I space as it's constituted at any given moment of time in any given society. It's that general argument that I'd like to put forward here. It's a claim for a transformed humanities, but it's a claim for a transformed university system as well, following Derrida's lead amongst others. And it particularly proposes that whatever we might think creativity refers to, it refers to a particular domain of relations, intrinsic to language and culture and our humanity, which has to be allowed to flow and reissue in many new forms in the university to come. Thank you.